Everybody, so modestly significant story tonight. The first Republican member of Congress has come out and called for the impeachment of Trump. That would be Justin Amash of Michigan, who is a libertarian, definitely goes against the grain of his party on numerous fronts and has since he entered Congress in 2011. He's somebody who obviously has a disdain for party orthodoxies and for the detrimental influences of hyper-partisanship. So if you had to have guessed who the Republican would be to be the first to come out and say, let's endorse Trump, you would have guessed Justin Amash, and sure enough, he did it today. Now, I don't agree with the rationale set forth in his tweet thread, but on some level, you have to commend somebody who has the independence of mind to come out and make a statement like this, which is obviously could imperil him politically. I wouldn't be shocked if he now faces a fairly serious primary challenger for 2020 for his House seat. I don't know that it's going to be sufficient to actually oust him in a primary, but the odds of that definitely went up. You know, some MAGA type, I'm sure, who lives in Grand Rapids is now saying to themselves, you know what, this guy's got to go. It's funny, I actually was Justin Amash's constituent briefly last year when I lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And just being there for a time, I definitely encountered some types who I could see being quite angered by Amash doing this. And I think you have to separate. It's important not to conflate whether you agree with what he said, which I do not, with the virtue of demonstrating that you're not totally indebted to the exigencies of your party leadership structure. I mean, that's a sensibility that we probably should be encouraging across the board, even if in isolated incidents we don't agree with what the fruits of it are. So, Justin Amash has been demonstrating his independence for a long time now on numerous issues. I mean, Democrats now are kind of heralding him as the second coming of Christ because he's the first Republican to say we need to impeach Trump. But, during the Obama years, Justin Amash was one of the most vocal critics of NSA surveillance, of all kinds of civil liberty violations under Obama. And Democrats either ignored or, denounced him for that. So now he's doing something which happens to further their partisan interests, and they're beside themselves with glee, which is a little silly, but you can understand, why they are so uproarious in their happiness over this, because a common mode of thinking among Democrats is, in order for impeachment to be viable, we need to have some Republicans, even a small minority, come on board with this, so it's not an entirely party line endeavor. And Justin Amash now gives them cover of a sort on that front, even though it's just one guy. I can't imagine that anybody else in Congress who's a Republican is going to support him on this. I mean, there are other members of the Liberty Caucus who have been critical of Trump, like Thomas Massie in isolated incidents, but Thomas Massie's has been very skeptical of the overall Russia narrative. So I don't see him joining with Amash on this, and I struggle to think of a single other Republican who'd be inclined to go down this route. So it's probably just going to be Amash alone, but that's sufficient for Democrats to at least purport that their burning desire to impeach Trump is not limited strictly to members of their own party. So what's the rationale that Amash sets forth? Well, again, I think it's a little bit flimsily argued. And I think that he ought to be pressed to give more detail as to his reasoning. So let me just pull it up here. So he says that he has 4 principal conclusions, and let's just go down the list. Number 1, Attorney General Barr has deliberately misrepresented Mueller's report. Here we go again. I don't know how many times I need to rebut this, because obviously it's had no effect. You don't have to be a fan of Bill Barr per se in order to find it ridiculous that people are running around claiming that he somehow egregiously misrepresented the Mueller report with his March 24 letter, in which he didn't purport to summarize the entire report, because the report was 448 pages, and how could a top-line 4-page letter possibly encompass the entirety of the 448-page report? That's ridiculous. Barr, at the time, had to, for a number of reasons, inform the public what the basic conclusions were in the Mueller report. So Mueller submitted the report. I mean, it's like I'm speaking to a classroom of kids right now, because I've gone through this so many times, but apparently it needs to be said again. Mueller submitted the report on March 22nd. Less than 2 days later, Bill Barr puts out a letter in which he quotes Mueller on both collusion and obstruction, and accurately reflects what Mueller concluded. There's just no two ways about it. You can go read this piece from Jack Goldsmith on Lawfare, and Lawfare is by no means a Trump apologist outlet. It's been one of the most bullish places on the internet with regard to the entire Trump-Russia saga. But Jack Goldsmith wrote on Lawfare that he finds it inane that people are saying that Bill Barr somehow maliciously distorted the report. And even if he did, which he didn't, but let's say he did, the report is out. It came out less than a month later. It came out on April 18th. It's so tedious to go over this, but why does it matter if Bill Barr misrepresented the report? We now have the report. I was just in Barnes & Noble today, and there's this giant stack of paper copies of the Mueller report on sale. 3 different versions that you can go into a Barnes & Noble or any, a bookstore near you and purchase a book version of the Mueller report. I don't know who the hell is actually buying that stuff. I think a lot of people just want it so they can display it on their fireplace or something, or on their coffee table, show that they're an informed citizen or whatever. But that's kind of sad. I mean, you're spending, I don't know how much it was, $20 to get a copy of a report that you can literally find in 2 seconds on the internet. I know older people might appreciate that or whatever, but it's still a little sad. I actually remember my late grandmother had a copy of the 9/11 report in book form, which seemed reasonable to me, just as like having a historical artifact. And I guess there are certain people who feel the same way with the Mueller report, even though it's an entirely different set of circumstances, obviously. But anyway, I mean, that's why what Amash is saying here is it's almost frivolous. I mean, the report is out. Number 2. According to the Amash tweet thread, President Trump has engaged in impeachable conduct. Okay, well, I mean, what do you mean by that? He goes on to elaborate later on in the thread, but he says that Mueller's report reveals that President Trump engaged in specific actions and a pattern of behavior that meet the threshold for impeachment. Not quite, actually. I mean, Mueller didn't comment on the utility of impeachment. That was not within his purview. He was reporting to the Department of Justice. So his superior here was Bill Barr, and it's not within his investigative ambit to make any claim one way or another about the wisdom of impeachment. So a little bit of a weird phrasing there. Amash goes on. In fact, Mueller's report identifies multiple examples of conduct satisfying all the elements of obstruction of justice, and undoubtedly any person who is not the President of the United States would be indicted based on such evidence. Now, here's why that analogy doesn't hold. This particular investigation was so incredibly unique that likening it to any run-of-the-mill obstruction of justice case, it doesn't pass muster, because there are so many unique circumstances which stand alone that led to this case coming about. So, in a typical obstruction of justice case, if somebody robs a bank and then they try to intimidate a witness from testifying who saw them robbing the bank, or they tell their partner to destroy evidence which proves that they robbed the bank, that person generally is subject to obstruction of justice charges. Whereas there's nothing remotely as straightforward in this case. I mean, it's true, yes, that there does not need to be established underlying criminality in order for obstruction charges to be brought. But the lack of underlying criminality here, at the very least, complicates the case, such that I think it's really unfeasible to insist that it's just a open and shut case of obstruction with any one of these cases. I mean, in every one of the potentially obstructive actions that Mueller delineates in Volume 2 of the report, he weighs competing factors. I mean, that's what Barr said in his letter, which then got construed as somehow Barr trying to cover up for Trump or distorting the report. Well, no, I read the report. I read it somewhat carefully. I'm not a genius, but I like to think that I'm able to read a document and understand it. And clearly, in every single instance set forth by Mueller as it relates to obstruction, Mueller does in fact weigh competing factors as to whether the actions Trump took could be regarded as obstructive. So, I mean, there was a defense attorney could go through and he could bring out other information that's not included in the report that could be exculpatory for Trump. The point is, none of this is blindingly obvious, especially given the constitutional questions that arise with regard to whether the head of the executive branch can be committing an obstructive act if that act falls within his Article 2 powers, such as firing a subordinate like Comey. Trump and Giuliani dispute the version of events that Don McGahn relates as to whether Trump directed him to fire Mueller. So, I mean, we don't even have all the information about what these supposedly obstructive acts entailed. And if it were to be tested in court, or in the context of an impeachment hearing, there would be a representative from the president to argue against it. Or rather, if the House impeached, then it would go to the Senate for a conviction trial, at which point there would be lawyers representing the president arguing against the conviction. And that's what happened in the case of Bill Clinton, which the Senate did not convict, as we all know. So, I mean, I just think Amash errors a little bit in depicting this as so blindingly obvious, as if there aren't all kinds of complicated issues around obstruction. And I note that Amash doesn't mention collusion at all. I mean, that's a distant memory now, I guess, even though collusion was the whole reason there was any investigation in the first place. And Mueller emphatically concluded that no collusion existed. I mean, I guess we're all supposed to gloss over that point, which seems a little silly. All right, so number 3 on Amash's list, partisanship has eroded our system of checks and balances. Okay, true. I remember when Peter Strzok was testifying before the House it was either June or July of last year, sometime in the summer of last year. And the Republicans were asking him legitimate oversight questions that you would want the oversight body to pose to a powerful official within the security state apparatus about their actions as it relates to a high-profile and consequential criminal investigation that engulfed the entire political discussion for, 3 years. Whereas Democrats just complained that anybody was asking him questions in the first place. So they didn't exercise their proper oversight duties. And likewise, when Michael Cohen testified before Congress in February of this year, Republicans whined and complained that Michael Cohen was even there. They didn't ask him any legitimate questions for the most part, except Amash, actually, who did ask some good questions to Cohen. And Republicans, including AOC, and Democrats, rather, including AOC, I have to acknowledge, asked Cohen some legitimate questions. And they didn't even have to have any bearing on collusion or Russia. They could just have bearing on Cohen's dealings with Trump for 10 years as his private, personal lawyer and fixer. Obviously, there are certain matters that Cohen would be privy to that it's worthwhile to explore because they could shed light on the official actions undertaken by the president. So Democrats were, very enthusiastic about trying to ascertain information on that front, whereas Republicans had no interest. So, yes, he's right that partisanship has eroded checks and balances, at least most egregiously with respect to oversight. So, no argument there. I don't know what that has to do with impeachment. And then number 4, few members of Congress have read the report. Okay, I guess that's true. I'd like to actually know with certainty how many members of Congress actually read the report. I'm sure he's probably right that a small number of them read it page, front to back. And really they should read it. Even if you disagree or agree, you think it's a hoax or you think collusion is the worst thing ever, it's probably your responsibility as a elected member of Congress to read the report, considering how consistently this issue just completely dominates the congressional agenda, dominates the media, dominates everything. So I think it's your responsibility to, at this point, over a month later, with the report having been public, if you don't read it, I'm a little leery of that. But again, I don't know what really that has to do with the Mueller report. Remember, the Mueller report as well is it shouldn't be taken as the unimpeachable word of God. It's a narrative. And there's plenty of underlying evidence that didn't make its way into the report. I've reported on some of that, meaning certain people who were interviewed by the Mueller team, and I haven't put this out publicly yet, but I'm going to. Whatever they provided didn't make its way into the report, curiously. So there's a whole breadth of information that was gathered by the Mueller prosecutors, which just got swept under the rug and the public doesn't have access to, even though it could be exculpatory. So when you're reading the report, you got to remember that you have a self-interested narrator who's guiding you through this storyline, and it's not above criticism. And that's why, Devin Nunes kind of mocks the dossier. He mocks the report as the Mueller dossier because he views it as having very little credibility in terms of how certain things are framed, given information that he is privy to that is not reflected in the report. So, I don't know. I think this is going to give another boost to the impeachment brigades. I think there's going to be another push this coming week to demand that Mueller set a date to come testify. And whenever he testifies, the entire nation's going to be riveted to the TV and to the internet. And all bets are off at that point. Because if Mueller makes one statement that is construed, that could be in any way remotely construed as strengthening the case against Trump, people are just going to go wild. So that's where we're at. And I'll leave it there for now. Have a great night.